Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to step away from our PvE side with this video, and instead I'm going to bring you a PvP guide. Not just any PvP guide though, but a class picking guide for those of you focused on PvP and TBC. I will not be diving into each class deeply, class changes, or specific matchups, as I don't play any of those classes besides Warlock, and I'm 100% sure there are people better suited to make those type of guides than myself. So instead, I'd like to quickly elaborate on the strengths and weaknesses of each class, along with some of the comps each class is viable with. My goal here is to simply spread the knowledge that I've learned from myself by playing a lot of PvP on these private servers, as well as the information I've received from multi-glads, and give players, both new and returning, an idea of what each class excels at, what they struggle at, and most importantly, what PvP is like at level 70 in TBC. This video I will be talking mainly about Arena, as each class's role more or less remains the same in Battlegrounds as it was in Classic, with the massive addition of being able to see everyone's damage done in the Battleground. I really like that, don't judge me. A side note, please do not rip my head off if I miss something. This is all based off of what I have seen during my perpetually never-ending days on these private servers. If you have any strengths, weaknesses, or anything else you want to add to the list, let me know in the comments and I'll add it to the list so future viewers can see the additions. TLDR, for those that are already wondering, you can push high with every class. Some classes much easier than others, but with the dedication from you and your teammates, you'll be able to cruise. Now let's get started. So let's begin. We're going to start with Druids since they seem to be really popular, at least for healing. Now, there's a good amount of talk about the Druids, so bear with me. Their toolkit is chock full of amazing abilities with very little downsides, making them an amazing pick for Arena. Some of the most notable strengths of Druids are how mobile they are, their survivability, and their escapability. A Druid can be hard to pin down. They're able to shift out of all the polys, slows, and roots, also making them excel at kiting. Another helpful thing Druids can do, well, is stealth, allowing them to remain unseen until they feel like coming out. This can be extremely annoying to the enemy for obvious reasons. Druids are pretty hard to kill as well. Some say they're the hardest to kill. They have plate level armor while in bear form, and they can escape pretty much any situation. They're immune to sap while in bear or cat form. They can remove poisons, which is huge because shamans have to put a totem down to cleanse a poison. They've got fairy fire, which is phenomenal in Arena, preventing any enemy from stealthing. They have a buff that they can give to all party members called Mark of the Wild, which buffs all attributes and armor. On top of that, they are the kings or queens of attrition and the least vulnerable to mana drains. They can also cleanse Viper Sting, shape shift out of drains, and don't forget about Innervate. Guys, Druids are insane. But as for the specific specs with Druids, starting with Boomy, this is an extremely underrepresented class, and many people will tell you that Boomy is arguably the worst spec in for Arena. I can't speak on that, thus I couldn't find any information on Boomy in arenas at all. I do know that they're pretty bursty, and they have a semi-popular build called Restokin, which is a more offensive healing spec, it seems, plus giving you Moonkin form, making you even more tanky. That's about the extent of my knowledge on Boomies. So if you or anyone you know has pushed as solely Boomy, please let us know in the comments. As for Feral, while still underrepresented in Arena, you do see them. Usually partnered up with the Rogue, Feral Druids can supply solid bursts and pressure on any enemy. Feral is also exceptional at healing on the side if needed, thanks to talents like Nurturing Instinct. Combine that with other talents like Fairy Fire Feral, which allows them to use Fairy Fire in cat or bear form, allowing you to remain in cat form, thus saving more mana. Feral is just as, if not more mobile than Resto, thanks to feline swiftness. And probably the best thing about Feral is the two talents called Primal Tenacity and Predatory Instinct, making them super hard to CC and AoE fear. Now lastly, Resto. Some would consider this the best healer in Arena, and for good reason. On top of all the Druid abilities, talents, and toolkit, they heal mainly through healing over time effects, commonly known as HOTS. They are better than casting heals in Arena due to so many interrupts and spell locks that can happen, along with many line of sight spots that can happen as well. Another massive aspect of HOTS is that they have no reduce effect from Curse of Tongues, which reduces output of the healers greatly. Also, Light Boom heals on Dispel. It's a hot that you put on somebody, and it'll heal over time, or heal at the end of it, or you can Dispel it, and it'll heal them as well. Not only that, but Resto Druids are the tankiest healer that has many CCs like Feral Charge, Entangling Roots, Cyclones, Hibernate, Bash. So yeah, you can say Resto Druids are overpowered. As for the weaknesses, they don't have much, but they're not perfect. To list some of the major ones, they cannot dispel anything. They are also weak against dispels at the same time, meaning most, if not all of their stuff can be dispelled. All their hots, everything, excluding Cyclone. Resto damage itself is lower than the other healers. Boomy's damage is sus at best, and lastly, you can be hibernated in bear or cat form, and tree form also can be banished. There are many viable comps for druids, but they're most commonly seen with warriors, warlocks, and rogues. Next up, the priest. Another very good and quite popular arena class. They're amazing healers for different and quite opposite reasons than the rest of druids. Some would say they're the best healers for offensive comps as well. Both Discipline and Shadow are extremely versatile and come with extremely important abilities and talents in their toolkit. Starting with Mass Dispel, added in TBC, an extremely overpowered spell that dispels both offensively and defensively in a 15-yard range, which is nice, but not the overpowered reason. It's overpowered because it can dispel ice blocks off mages as well as divine shield from paladins, and to top it off, it can find rogues in stealth. Yeah, overpowered. Which leads to my next point. They can offensively and defensively dispel. They're the only class that can do that on demand, which, as you can imagine, is massive in PvP. Priests come equipped with phenomenal abilities that can turn the tides of many matches. They can mana burn, which was buffed in TBC, thus it has less of a cast time. Mana burn is extremely useful in arena, and there's many comps specifically built around mana draining the opposing team. Priests bring excellent defensive with pain suppression, along with an AoE fear on a shortish cooldown, and then fear ward, which puts a buff on you, or whoever you put it on, that will consume a fear, meaning the enemy needs to fear you twice. Speaking from a Warlock main, this is very annoying. They get increased stun, fear, and silence resistance with Unbreakable Will. Shadow Fiend, which is amazing for getting mana back, while applying pressure with moderate damage. Priests, of course, have many buffs, including Power Word Fortitude, Divine Spirit, Shadow Protection, and Inner Fire. And let's not forget about one of the most important things about Priests, Power Word Shield, commonly known as Bubble. This is overpowered in PvP because it prevents rage from warriors and, more importantly, spell pushback. As for the specific specs, just like in Classic, Shadow is a very, very good PvP class. On top of all the things I just listed, they have really good damage with solid pressure and great burst. They also use damage over time, commonly referred as dots. They are great for spread damage and pressure, plus gives the enemy healer more things to dispel, resulting in time spending more mana. Shadow Priests also have Shadow Form, increases your damage while in form, as well as reduces your physical damage by 15% while in Shadow Form. Lastly, very clutch, they can off heal, which can save lives. A few downsides to Shadow are that they can't heal while in Shadow Form, and they also have to hard cast a lot of their spells besides, I think, Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death. And also, their dots can be dispelled, which can be a good thing, but can also be a bad thing depending on the situation. Shadows also usually focus in arena, which can be scary at times, especially when you're learning. As for the healing side, typically, well, to be honest, all the time, priests are not holy. The toolkit for discipline is just insane compared to holy. They, on top of all the other priest strengths I listed earlier, they have prayer of mending, commonly referred to as POM, P-O-M, which is a powerful instant heal that bounces back and forth to teammates when they take damage. It can be quite irritating to work around that as the enemy. They are very flexible with comps. They can play with many different classes and still be viable. You are flexible with speccing for more offense or defense. You have incredible raw healing. And lastly, Discipline can do pretty decent damage. Some downsides of Discipline, well, priests in general, is that they're pretty squishy. Discipline being the squishiest healer and Shadow being the squishiest DPS. Pretty close with Mage, but Mage has Ice Barrier and Frost Armor, so I'd give the nod to Shadow Priest, really. Priests also have horrible mobility, as in none. They are vulnerable to poisons and curses, since they can't dispel either of them, as well as they are more vulnerable to dispels than the other healers and have a decently high skill cap. Overall though, Priest is an amazing choice if you're unsure if you want to heal or DPS. While they have many viable comps and can play with pretty much anybody, they are commonly seen with mages, rogues, and hunters. Next up, the mages. Mages once again excel in PvP for the same reasons as in Classic, along with the new abilities they received in TBC. Before we start, a little TLDR on the mages. Pampyro was very fun and a hilarious build. If things go your way in arena, you can obliterate somebody one shot. It's hilarious. It's happened to me a time or two, embarrassingly enough. In the earlier seasons 1 and 2, Pampyro is actually more viable than the later seasons, and you'll actually see quite a few of them. Because in the earlier seasons, there's not much resilience in the game, and you can actually get pretty hype spell power gear from Karazhan. And you actually end up seeing some high rated Pampyros. Fire is sadly really underrepresented and rarely seen, if at all. It's got the same survivability as Pampyro, just without the huge burst of the one shot. Thus, the go-to is usually Frost. Especially in later seasons, their toolkit is amazing. Some of their strengths include insane control with all the slows, novas, sheeps, etc. They have excellent CC with Polymorph, which has low DR shares. This all makes the Mage really annoying to kill due to those reasons, as well as being able to just blink away. also making them one of the best classes at kiting enemies, making melee a snack for mages. Combine that with the ability to ice block twice due to cold snap, giving the frost mage some much needed survivability. They have counterspell and a relatively short cooldown, but more importantly, you can and should spec into improved counterspell, which gives your counterspell a 50% chance to silence the enemy when you use it. To continue to add to the long list of strengths, mages have excellent burst and damage that they can control and use on demand. A powerful water elemental that can slow, nova, and apply some slight pressure damage, which you can cold snap and resummon after if you like. And of course, evocate, giving them a rather large mana pool. Now, while there are many things the mage excels at, sadly, it's not easy to learn mage and master all of that. Mages are also very squishy outside of their fel armor. They also typically get focused in matches, thus it can be pretty scary trying to learn all this as a new mage. Mages are also very vulnerable to dispels, as all of their slows, novas, and sheeps can be dispelled, as well as their ice blocks by a mass dispelling priest. Mages also rely pretty heavily on setups, especially Pompyro. While they do have evocate, they are still very dependent on mana, and it is finite. Run them and they're out of the game. And lastly, they are weak against Druids and Warlocks. Both Druids and Warlocks will be seen in many and most arena comps, and oftentimes you will see them together. Mages are most commonly seen with rogues, priests, and hunters. Now to my personal favorite, the Warlock. Warlocks are one of, if not the most popular DPS class, and arguably the best. I may be biased here, and for good reason, but Locks are an amazing PvP class. Their toolkits are stocked with abilities to quite literally carry your team on your back to victory. The infamous SL build, Soul Link Siphon Life, makes you super tanky, due to talents like Soul Link, Demonic Embrace, Fel Stamina, and many, many more, giving you not only insane survivability, but more health than all the other casters. They have massive damage, and a unique damage at that, because they can spread their damage with dots, thus slowly rotting the entire enemy team away at the same time. Locks can counter pretty much every single class, excluding skilled rogues and the occasional annoying skilled warrior. As is known, Warlocks have a variety of demons that they can use to fit any situation, each pet having its niche uses in Arena. Succubus is never really used, only as Destro, and sadly Destro is pretty unrepresented as well. Imp is only used to buff your party with Fire Shield pre-game. The Voidwalker is used when playing against melee to put a Voidwalker stack shield on you pre-game, and in-game if you need it against melee. They can use AoE taunt called Suffering, which in TBC was reworked to reduce the enemy's chance to hit by 10%. And of course the Voidwalker stack shield, like I said earlier, it's as strong as ever. But it's the main pet that really shines, which is a strength in itself really, the Fel Hunter. Capable of dispelling, purging, has pretty good damage, and is a nuisance to all healers. Just be kind of careful with priests though, because any damage you do to them, if they have prayer mending on them, it'll just bounce and heal their teammates. And of course, let's not forget about the spell lock. And then on top of that, you can use a cooldown called Fel Domination, which will pretty much instantly summon another Fel Hunter out for you. So you can double spell lock in emergencies. On top of that, locks have phenomenal self-healing with Siphon Life and Drain Life, as well as taking 20% increased healing from a new armor buff they get called Fel Armor, which is actually 26% if you're spec'd into it, which you will be. Combine that with our strong attrition with Life Tap, Drain Life, Siphon Life, like I said, we're really hard to kill. Warlocks have relatively strong CCs with Fear and Death Coil, both very, very important for not only the Warlock, but for the whole team. A lot of games are won and lost off of just that Death Coil. A lot of times in high ratings, an entire match will depend on straight CCs, so it's a huge strength of a Warlock if you use it correctly. To continue to list, both the Warlock and their pet have quite literally an endless mana pool due to Life Tap and Mana Feed, as well as trash buffs to help protect yourself and your teammates from dispelling important buffs off you. We of course also bring Hellstones as well. Something that is very important is that we also have two good schools of magic, Shadow and Fire. This is important because if you get locked out of Shadow, you can simply cast fire spells in the meantime, or vice versa. A lot of locks like to bait the enemy kicks and interrupts with our fire spells like Immolate or Searing Pain, so then we can get it kicked and then be free to cast our shadow spells or our fears. Warlocks have two specs, Affliction and Demonology. Both are very, very good and used in different situations, varying on the comp of the team. Not only that, but in those specs, they can even be more flexible and go for more offense or more defense. Unstable Affliction is a new Affliction spell, and it is insane. It's a hard-hitting dot, but more importantly, if it gets dispelled, it blows up and severely damages whoever dispelled it. And to top it off, Warlocks don't have many counters, like I said earlier, Skilled rogues can be quite annoying, and warriors can be pretty annoying sometimes too. As for the weaknesses, most annoyingly in my opinion, is that we have absolutely no mobility. Absolutely none. It's tilting at times. But even Achilles had a weakness, am I right? Along with that, warlocks are very vulnerable to dispels. A large priority of our damage comes from dots, which are dispellable, along with our CCs, which are also dispellable. Also, due to dots, our damage is very, very predictable and slow. And because it has to ramp up, we also do not have that much burst. We are also extremely pet dependent. If our Fell Hunter dies, we usually die as well if we cannot get another one out. Lastly, soul shards. I don't really need to elaborate on the reasons why this one's annoying, but the pro tip here, stay stocked up on soul shards. Warlocks are viable with a lot of people, but they are commonly seen with druids, rogues, and priests. Shadow and discipline. Next up, rogues. Rogues are infamous in TBC, as if they weren't strong in Classic, they just get stronger in TBC. Many strengths, while not having too many weaknesses, makes this a very popular class for PvP. They're arguably the best melee in the game. They're extremely mobile. I'm talking next level mobility with stuff like Shadow Step, Sprint, and Prep. They're still the king of CC with Sap and Blying being just as strong. They got the same amazing interrupts with short cooldown kicks, Garrote Silence, their stuns, and of course the Deadly Throw, with the glove bonus making them literally have a ranged interrupt. They've got respectable on-demand burst and are also capable of playing the attrition playstyle as well. Rogues are the best for peeling for teammates while also being the hardest to peel, thus having amazing pressure on whichever enemy you're about to nuke. They have great utility with their poisons, whether that's wound poisoning, crippling poison, or mind-numbing poison. In any matter, they're all annoying. And if that wasn't enough to make you roll a rogue or hate them forever, they have scary high survivability due to evasion, cheat death, cloak, and vanish. Second you think you're going to finish a rogue off, cheat death saves him, and then he cloaks, vanishes, sprints away, resets the fight, comes back and saps you. It can be tilting. It's crazy and quite scary how good rogues are in TBC. But as with every class, they do have a few weaknesses. They legit have no self heals at all. And not only that, but they're really reliant on their opener, and more importantly, their cooldowns. If you can get them with their abilities on cooldown, they're actually extremely squishy. Lastly, RNG can kind of screw you over as a rogue if the enemy resists your stuns, your CCs, or you have shitty cloak RNG as well. Rogues are commonly seen with mages, priests, locks, and druids. Next up, shamans. Oh dear shamans. I will admit to you guys that I do not know too much about shamans, and I actually couldn't find too much on the specs or even find someone who could speak on them fully that was at a gladiator level. However, we do know that all the shaman specs are unrepresented, and 2 of them usually are considered not viable by most people. Despite that, they are a niche pick and they can actually work in specific scenarios. The 2 DPS specs, while both having the ability to burst very hard, their damage is proc based, thus both specs are less common and players tend to gravitate more towards the restoration spec. Resto Shaman is a strong arena healer if in the right hands and in the right comp. They might not bring the offensive capabilities like a priest or safe healing and mobility like the Resto Druids, but do you know what they do bring? An offensive dispel in the form of Purge, coupled with the insane utility of their totems. A ton of totems. Grounding Totem, when used correctly, is overpowered. Windfree Totem for those big slapping melee DPS, and of course Trimmer Totems for the much needed fear breaks. Earthbind Totem, and many, many more. They have an interrupt on an extremely short cooldown, 6 seconds, 5 seconds if spec'd into it, as well as an instant slow called Frost Shock. And don't forget about the biggest thing to be added in TBC, Bloodlust, or Heroism for Alliance. It's an insane spell that drastically helps their teammates conquer their enemies. Another thing that you should keep in mind is the Ghost Wolf ability, which any shaman should have talented for Arena. It offers an instant 40% movement increase that helps you kite your enemies. Its proper usage is critical to mastering the shaman and climbing the ranks, since the shaman gets often trained by the enemy. Shamans, while strong, will be in a troublesome spot in TBC Classic. Rogues and warlocks are a hard counter to shamans, and you can expect to see many of both of those classes in the arena, often together. Also a few things. Shamans don't have a defensive cooldown, thus their survivability is subpar. They're slow, Frost Shock, shares a cooldown with their interrupt, Earth Shock. Most of the shaman spells, be it damage or healing, have to be casted. That, coupled with the fact that most of their spells are nature, makes them really vulnerable to interrupts, since one interrupt can shut down most of your kit. Also, they are single healer in the game without any form of hard CC, which doesn't help them either. That being said, they are pretty fun and they are good healers. Shamans are commonly seen with warriors, mages, rogues, warlock, and the occasional paladin, who they can actually form an interesting and often underestimated comp. All right, on to hunters, the kings of PvE in TBC. One of the strongest world PvP classes. However, this is about arena, and hunters are very underrepresented in arena as well. Despite that, this class hurts. They have insane burst pressure, and if the enemy is not too quick to react, they will die before they realize the hunter was even on them. They have a fun and unique toolkit with some specs they can play around with that help your teammates out tremendously. You have aim shot, which has a mortal strike effect, lessening the healing on the enemy. You can dispel with arcane shot. You have excellent dispel protection with 30% dispel resistance on Viper from your marksman talents if you're marksman. But also, if you use a Scorpid pet, it applies 5 stacks of poison that can act as trash buffs, making Viper Sting even harder to dispel. You have amazing interrupts, slows, and stuns with improved wing clip, a frost trap with entrapment, concussive shot, scatter shot, and intimidation if you're spec'd into it. If you're BM, Beast Mastery, you get Bestial Wrath and Beast Inside, making you literally unCCable, and it's the scariest thing in arena, period. If you're marksman, you get Silencing Shot, and of course, you have all your traps as well. The scatter trap combo is insanely powerful with a low cooldown and long duration, especially if you're playing against comps with no defensive dispel, and of course, you guys have Feint Def. Some downsides to Hunter are that they are rather squishy with not really any good personals to aid you in getting beat down. You of course have the dead zone. Although this is patch dependent on the range, 8 yards, otherwise it's 5 yards, and it's not nearly as annoying, but still a slight weakness. Hunters are very vulnerable to CC outside of Bestial Wrath if you're a BM, and you also have no control CC at all. Mages can sheep, locks can fear, Jews can cyclone, etc. Hunters do not have a spammable CC like that. They are extremely reliant on line of sight as well, besides your pet of course. And since we're talking about pets, another weakness is that your pet does not have resilience. And just like the warlocks, if your pet dies, you might die as well. So the plan here is to kill the pet. The hunter loses a ton of damage and more than likely will die. Hunters are commonly seen with priests, warriors, druids, and warlocks if you're doing a mana drain comp. Alright guys, next up, the paladin. The mighty plate wearing, hammer smashing, holy light bearers. So this is another severely underrepresented class, specifically protection and ret. Thus, I honestly don't have too much to say about paladins, so please, if you are a big brain paladin and you want to add to the list, put it in the comments and I'll pin the comment. Anyway, you can find some holy paladins, but even they are pretty scarce. In any matter, they are pretty tanky due to wearing plate. They all have their blessings, which are super helpful, like Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Freedom, and many more. Paladins also have auras to choose from. They have defensive magic, disease, and poison dispel, an extremely long stun on a relatively short CD called Hand of Justice, commonly known as Hajj. They're almost never targeted, which is nice. And lastly, lest you forget, they've got Bop and Divine Shield. I was able to find out that Ret actually has a potential for extremely high burst and even higher when paired with a Shaman for Wind Fury. To counter that, Ret also has mana issues and is also highly dependent on weapon swings. So any resists or disarms and you're hurting. And I think a big problem with Holy Paladins, it's kind of obvious why they're not really chosen that much. They have to hard cast all of their heals. They have absolutely no instant cast, no hots, no healing reduction, and they're the only healer without an AoE spell. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are very vulnerable to dispels and your Divine Shield can be mass dispelled. Lastly, Paladins have literally no counter spells or silences unless you are a Blood Elf. Paladins are commonly seen with warriors, shamans, Ret and Resto are surprisingly powerful in 2v2, and priests. The last one on the list, guys, the Mighty Warrior. Unlike the last few classes, warriors are in an absolutely phenomenal spot for TBC. That's why I left them for last. They're really quite bursty. They've got an unlimited resource with rage, and they wear plate, making them very tanky. One of the most important strengths of a warrior is the fact that they are extremely difficult to CC. Berserker Stance and Death Wish both make it really hard to get a fear off. And while we're here, Death Wish itself is a major strength. It's a massive cooldown. 30-second immunity to fear and 20-second increased damage. Although take note that you do take 5% increased damage with it as well, so be careful. On top of that, they have Hamstring, the ultimate slow, making it hard for any enemies to get away from the overpowered warrior. They also have one of the best abilities in the game, Intercept. It's one of the only controlled range stuns in the game. On a 30-second cooldown, you can get it down to 15 seconds on the cooldown if you spec into it, along with having the 4-piece arena set bonus. And on top of that, it's a 3-second range stun that cannot be dodged or parried. It's insanely good. They also have Mortar Strike, reducing healing by 50%, and also, which is new, a Spell Reflect. And when it's timed right, it's one of the best spells in the game. Another thing to consider is that they are extremely good against rogues, which will be all over the place. Not only just because of the plate, but they have long bleeds that rogues cannot cloak. Plus, Booming Voice, and of course, Intercept that cannot be dodged, so no matter what, it will get them through Cloak of Shadows. To just keep adding to the list, Mace Specialization is pretty good. It's a chance to stun that does not share DRs with Intercept. They have an amazing pressure on a single target, and they're able to slow them down with Hamstring and keep on them the whole fight. The second they get away, intercept them, and you're back on them. It's crazy how good they are, and it's also crazy how annoying they are for anyone who's not a warrior. A good warrior is very hard to get away from for most classes. And lastly, to round up the strengths, warriors have their epic AoE fear. As for the weaknesses of the heavy plate-cladded beasts, most notably, close to no mobility, they're limited to charging and intercepting. Also, added to that is a lack of self-heals, and thus survivability is kind of sus. Although when paired with a healer, they feel unstoppable. Another downside is that they're heavily reliant on rage, and shields like Bubble from a priest or Voidwalker Sack from a warlock nets no rage for the warrior. They're also quite vulnerable to being kited, specifically to roots and slows like a Druid or a Mage. Warriors are also vulnerable to magic damage as well, as they take extra damage during Berserker Stance and Death Wish. Lastly, warriors are not really beginner friendly, and it takes some time and practice to master, as does each of these classes really, but warrior isn't a face roll easy class to get down in arena, but once you get it down, you will be face rolling. Warriors are commonly seen with priests, mages, hunters, locks, and of course, resto druids. Well guys, that's it for me today. I sincerely hope that this helps someone out there. As I mentioned before we began, I am not a huge brain PvPer. I am very much still a student of the game. Most of these guys that I've shown you in these clips I would consider friends, who have taught me many things about PvP, and were gracious enough to answer all my questions regarding their respective classes, and for that, I thank you all again. Well, I'm off. In the meantime, feel free to check out my own Twitch and YouTube channel, where you will always be able to find TBC content. Also, before I go, I'd like to mention that we run a weekly TBC podcast over at Cargos Gaming's channel, where we talk everything TBC. I'll leave a link to that in the description. As always, much love, and see you on the next one.